because we're going to get more context now and perspective on all of this. NBC senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett's here, and we've got our chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker standing by. Laura, I mean, this was so fascinating to have this conversation and then get a preview of some of the arguments. Yes. So let's take it on from a legal perspective first. Let's finish this First Amendment thing, because we're hearing that a lot. Oh, this is criminalizing First Amendment. This is political speech. Where are we going in this country if you can't speak your mind? Is that a valid legal argument?
If he had been charged with what he said at the Ellipse on the morning of January 6th, I think this would be a different case. The prosecutors have made it crystal clear here. He is not being charged for his speech. He is being charged for the means that he used to try to subvert the will of the people by putting forth fraudulent slates of electors and therefore defrauding the U.S. government. It's not about calling the election rigged. It's not about saying that he had actually won. It's about the means that he used to do that. And the best example I can give you is if you look at your bank account today and you see a bunch of money missing, it looks like the bank took it out wrongly. You get to challenge that. You even get to go on TV and say, I think I lost a bunch of money and the bank is at fault. What you don't get to do is to rob that bank or to try to rob that bank. And that is what the Justice Department is accusing the former president of the United States of doing.
Another issue that's come up with the lawyers' interviews, and we can see this happening, is an argument that President Trump sincerely believed that the election was stolen, and therefore you can never prove that he had a corrupt intent to defraud the American people. Is that a valid argument?
Well, that'll be for the jury to decide. The issue here, though, is there is a whole bunch of evidence, and this is just in the indictment. This isn't everything they have. In the indictment, they lay out chapter and verse all of the times that Mr. Trump was told by everyone and their mother that the election fraud claims were bogus and that he had lost and that he was aware of it and that he had acknowledged it on at least some occasions. Now, the jury is going to decide whether that amounts to corrupt intent, but that's the evidence they have. The evidence they have is that he was told and he just didn't want to hear it.
All right, let's turn for a moment to Kristen Welker on the political side of this. We had a big discussion with the lawyers. You just heard Kristen about when this trial might take place. It's really important because if this runs past the election, there is a world in which Donald Trump could be reelected. And there is the potential of pardoning himself or ordering his Justice Department to drop the case. So it's this issue that we were going back and forth about, when is this trial going to happen? Very interesting and very important.
Very important, Savannah, because it speaks to the strategy here. Are the president and his legal team effectively trying to run out the clock so that the election is held before these cases go to court? In the meantime, he is trying to build momentum based off of this. From his first indictment to his third indictment, Savannah, he's only gotten politically stronger. A recent poll showing 71% of GOP voters do not think that he committed a crime. One poll shows him with a 37-point lead over his nearest rival, Ron DeSantis. Now, look, this cuts both ways, right? Because he's seen a spike in fundraising. He said on a fundraising email overnight. At the same time, his legal fees are going up. So his super PAC spent some $20 million in legal fees in the first part of this year alone, Savannah. And that effectively is more than they brought in. So that's the double-edged sword here. And I think the outstanding question, will there be a weight of this that becomes too great?
What's interesting, as I turn back to Laura on this issue of speedy trial, it belongs to the defendant. It's the defendant's right. It's to protect the defendant. It's in the Sixth Amendment. The government can't just hold you forever and say, oh, we'll try you one day. And there you are in this legal limbo. Yeah. On the other hand, the defendant can say, well, I waive that. Let's stretch it out a little bit longer. But the judge will decide. At some point, the defendant also can't stretch it out forever.
And the judge is also there to vindicate the rights of the public. The public has a right to a speedy trial as the victims of this alleged crime. And the judge is there to serve as a check. And in this case, especially where the alleged crime is about the disenfranchisement of voters, according to prosecutors, the judge is going to have to take that into account, too.
Well, it's a fascinating indictment. It goes to the heart of the matter, whether or not this election was stolen. We will continue to cover it, Laura.
Okay, let me hear that one more time. What did she say? The public has a right. It's curious because that doesn't seem to take precedent at the moment, or it hasn't in the last year or 3 years of indictments. The speediness hasn't been there, even though the charges are the most serious to every citizen, should be the most serious. It doesn't seem that, see, I'm not even old as Biden, and I'm actually misspeaking, but It doesn't seem that there's been this speedy trial and the right and the interest of the public given a charge.
Outstanding question. Will there be a
Let's just hear what she say one more time.
weight of this that becomes too great?
What's interesting as I turn back to Laura on this issue of speedy trial, it belongs to the defendant. It's the defendant's right. It's to protect the defendant. It's in the Sixth Amendment. The government can't just hold you forever and say, oh, we'll try you one day. And there you are in this legal limbo. Yeah. On the other hand, the defendant can say, well, I waive that. Let's stretch it out a little bit longer. But the judge will decide. At some point, the defendant also can't stretch it out forever.
And the judge is also there to vindicate the rights of the public. The public has a right to a speedy trial as the victims of this alleged crime, and the judge is there to serve as a check. And in this case, especially where the alleged crime is about the disenfranchised,
the defendant also can't stretch it out forever.
And the judge is also there to vindicate the rights of the public. The public has a right to a speedy trial as the victims of this alleged crime.
Stretch it out forever.
And the judge is also there to vindicate the rights of the public. The public has a right to a speedy trial as the victims of this alleged crime, and the judge is there to serve as a check. And in this case, especially where the alleged crime is about the disenfranchisement of voters, according to prosecutors, the judge is going to have to take that into account.
Yes. So the public are actually the victims, right? The public are actually the victims in this matter. And what's interesting is the public, the United States of America. So I've lived in different countries before. I mean, I've been traveling pretty much most of my life, to be honest, different parts of the country, not living, in some cases living, right? But I've been traveling, visiting other countries, and have lived in another country. And I've noticed the difference in how people behave. Yes, sociology, how people behave. And a lot of that has something to do with the politics of the country, how people do things, how people see things. In big cities where you have, I'm sorry to say this, but if you follow me, you will understand what I'm saying. In big cities, I have tend to notice urban cities, right? Across the world, different parts. Minorities don't seem to believe inherently that they have the same kind of rights as, majorities or, let's say, ethnic populations, right? Ethnic Danes, for example. When we look at minorities and how they organize behind voting, they don't, when you hear minorities, they automatically think the system's against them, right? But in the United States, often, not all the time with minorities, but often, right? It seems like some minorities are not voting. Some feel like the system is stacked against them, right? You hear this. And, but then when you look at it, let's take the United States, for example. When you look at its ethnic European background, Americans, right? The ones that consider themselves Americans, the ones that say they are American, the ones that, don't really pull on their roots from Europe so much, but pretty much are satisfied with being white, called white Americans, right? When you look at this group and you look at how they communicate and you go around the country, and I'm not saying in all cases is wrong or anything like that. I'm just saying there's a difference. A lot of them speak like they have inherent inalienable rights, and they get right down and will grab a gun and start talking about their rights. How much of that is, how far they will go with that, and what their intent is, what, their different views, because they're not all the same. People like this, they don't have the same views. Some people can be MAGA, some people can be anti-MAGA and still feel profoundly about being American and keeping their rights, protecting their rights, right? So let's not get it twisted here. But when you see this, they feel like it. They stand up. But ironically enough, given the charges on Trump, it doesn't seem like Americans feel like they have inalienable rights, because this would be a case where your inalienable rights are being challenged by a man, and his name is Donald Trump. That party, Republican Party, is hosting him. MAGA and all these people, they don't really feel like you, other Americans, have inalienable rights, and they're challenging that in the courts right now. If the election doesn't go their way, they could change the election because they have inalienable rights. I'm just pointing that out now. It's a little scary, but let's see how far this goes.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Former President Trump has been indicted in the special counsel's investigation with 4 new charges filed for efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. This marks the first time a former president has been charged in connection to disrupting the transfer of power between administrations. Today's indictment also comes just days after that same special counsel, Jack Smith, filed superseding charges against the former president in a separate case related to his handling of classified documents after leaving office. Mr. Trump also faces separate criminal charges for a third case in New York State, where earlier this year he pled not guilty to charges involving hush money payments during his 2016 campaign. But today's new charges could be among the most significant. Legal challenges Mr. Trump is facing, and a reminder he has denied any wrongdoing in all these cases. Let's bring in our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. You literally just received the indictment. You've had a chance to go through it. 4 charges. Can you tell us what they are?
Yes, Lester. This really focuses on all of the efforts that the former president undertook to try to overturn the will of the people, to overturn the election results. It is not, at least as on this first reading, about the violence that took place at the Capitol. As you can see there on your screen, obstruction-related charges, specifically obstructing the congressional vote count that happened on January 6th, and all of the steps that the former president and his allies took to try to stop that count, to try to stop the peaceful transition of power. So we're going to go through this. It is lengthy, spanning about 45 pages. But again, the former president of the United States, for the first time in history, has been indicted for trying to thwart the last election.
And to frame this from the beginning, this was never necessarily about the riot itself of January 6th, but what the prosecutors believe may have sparked that riot.
Well, and we had wondered for some time exactly what the charges would be, as everyone remembers those iconic images from the attack on the Capitol and the speech that he made preceding it. And we had wondered whether he would be charged with some sort of incitement-related crime. And we're going to need to go through it again. But on the first pass, this appears to relate to the actual steps that he tried to take to thwart the vote count. Right. So that's why we're going to, again, try to
I'll give you a moment to go through that. Let me bring in NBC's Garrett Haake, who has been covering the former president. Garrett, walk us through how this day has gone.
We know that a scalable data strategy is
Well, Lester, this is a day that the Trump campaign has long anticipated would happen. It was always a question of when, not if, in their minds, that he would face additional charges related to the 2020 campaign. And as has been the case in his previous indictments, the former president tried to scoop the announcement using his social media platform to post earlier today that he suspected this would come Friday, and to start questioning the timing of this indictment as a form of election interference, arguing that where it comes in the presidential campaign could only be an effort by President Biden to somehow derail his campaign. Since word of the indictment has broken, a former president's spokesman confirms to me that he was informed of the fact that he had been indicted. And the campaign sent out a lengthy statement using much the same language that they've used in the face of his other legal challenges over the years, calling this an un-American witch hunt, suggesting that it is purely political, even making hyperbolic comparisons to 1930s Nazi Germany and Soviet authoritarianism to describe the kinds of conduct here from the Justice Department going after the former president. So it's clear that he's going to fight this in the public sphere just as much as he fights it in a courtroom. That has already become such a key part of his presidential campaign, Lester. In fact, the former president's previous arraignments, particularly the New York arraignment, have been huge days for him from an online fundraising capacity. Things like this, which would have been badly damaging right away to other presidential candidates, haven't seemed to have the same effect. former president will be making this, I think, a key part of his campaign going forward as he fights these charges in the legal system.
All right, Garrett, we'll ask you to stand by. Let me bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. And Hallie, Garrett just walked us through some of the things the former president has said, trying to liken this to election interference in the 2024 election. Remind us again how this investigation began and the timing. It was before Mr. Trump was a presidential candidate.
That's right. As far as the special counsel investigation and then the special counsel, the investigation itself, and then the special counsel, of course, was created after Donald Trump did become a presidential candidate this cycle. I want to hit on a couple of key points, Lester, that we are learning from this indictment. First, the next big date, this indictment says that the former president has been summoned to appear on August 3rd, which is Thursday. So Thursday will be the day, based on this indictment, that we may see the former president. I'll leave it to the legal experts to talk through whether or not that date could change based on conversations with the former president's attorneys here. I would also note, and I think big picture, right, remind people what this is based on, right? At the core of this indictment appears to be the former president's insistence that this election, the 2020 election, was stolen from him. It was not. That was not true. And this indictment lays out a series of examples related to the former president's mindset. The prosecutors here are saying Donald Trump knew that wasn't true. He knew it wasn't true when he persisted in making these claims that were not founded of election fraud. He'd been told directly, they say he'd been informed directly that this was not the case. And yet he continued to make those claims through the election, after the election, before January 6th, after the January 6th. In fact, and this is not in the indictment, this is sort of me just telling you based on the reporting here, Donald Trump continues to make those claims even today, that the 2020 election was stolen from him illegally. Again, it was not. There is no evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. And I think it is interesting as we're looking through this indictment that it very specifically lays out his mindset. Remember, his attorney general, even at the time, Bill Barr, came out publicly and said there was no evidence of widespread fraud. This indictment lays out multiple instances where the former president, people around him, were told that it was not the case, Lester. And I think that mindset question has been an important one and continues to be an important one.
All right, Pally, I'll ask you to stand by as well. NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Kristen Welker joins me now. Kristen, we have seen everything leading up to this point. In fact, Mr. Trump himself has predicted this moment would happen. But to the extent that he's campaigning off it and seems to be enjoying his rise in the polls, the reality is these are very, very, very serious charges going forward.
You're absolutely right, Lester. These are very serious charges. Politically speaking, we have seen former President Trump really benefit from these indictments in the polls. And in terms of a spike in his fundraising, Lester, he's 37 points ahead of Ron DeSantis, his nearest GOP challenger. However, from a financial standpoint, if you take a look at what he's spent so far in 2023, he's outspent how much he has raised, his super PAC has, in legal fees. So that speaks to the fact that this is starting to chip away at his overall operation as he runs for re-election. But again, politically speaking, we have seen his polls increase. We've seen a spike in fundraising. That's the primary. What happens in the general election? That's another matter. We've gotten recent polling out just this week, Lester, that show that he is running neck and neck with President Biden. No surprise there. This is a deeply divided country. We expect whatever the ultimate general election race to be a close one. So it's not a surprise that you would see President Biden and former President Trump running neck and neck. But it does raise questions about what this could mean if, in fact, he is the Republican nominee. So at this point in time, we're seeing both sides of that. We're also watching in terms of the questions that remain to see how his Republican challengers respond to this, Lester. So far, you have a few of them, Chris Christie, Will Hurd, Asa Hutchinson, really sharpening their attacks against the former president, saying that, look, these mounting legal troubles make him a weak candidate in a general election. But so far, you're not seeing a chorus of voices. Ron DeSantis walking a very fine line, for example. Will that start to change in the upcoming debate now just a few weeks away? We'll have to see, Lester.
All right, Kristen, thank you. Let me bring in former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, for there to be conspiracy, there have to be other individuals. We don't know who those are.
Well, we don't know their names. At least they're not named in the indictment. But there's traditional charging language that prosecutors use in a conspiracy, Lester, citing to conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury. And then they list 6 known conspirators, not by name, but by description. 5 of them are attorneys. One of the 5 attorneys is a Department of Justice official. And then the 6th known conspirator, again, not named, is a political consultant. So there are others that are clearly on the radar of Jack Smith and his team, others who joined in a criminal conspiracy with Mr. Trump. So we'll certainly learn their names. The prosecutors, of course, know their names, but they are identified specifically in the indictment by the jobs they hold, the positions they held during the course of the conspiracy. Another point to make. Charging a conspiracy in a speaking indictment, as the Smith team did, gives us a tremendous amount of detail about the indictment and the allegations. So in that way, very similar, Lester, to the indictment that was returned and then superseded in the Southern District of Florida. Speaking indictments with tremendous detail. I hope people read it carefully.
These 4 charges we're looking at here now, how will they be defended? How would they typically be defended? Do you see any obvious weaknesses in the government's charges?
Okay, guys, let's have just released a voiceover feature.
2 seconds. Hold on. Let's get past this.
Well, I don't see weaknesses in the government's charges because I haven't had a chance yet to read the indictment carefully. But assuming that the government can adduce and prove in court everything it alleges in the indictment, my quick look at the indictment suggests that it's compelling and strong. That said, how do you defend against a case like this? So to your question, Lester, traditionally, typically, in these sorts of cases, the defendant will argue that he didn't have the requisite intent to commit these crimes. He may argue that he relied upon attorneys for their advice and counsel, and by doing so, he should be absolved of any criminal liability. Simply put, the government always has to prove intent. And often in these types of cases, a defendant will claim that he lacked the requisite intent. But, and this is important, there are numerous individuals also cited in this indictment who did the right thing by telling Mr. Trump that he lost the election. They are also listed in the indictment by position: the Vice President of the United States, Department of Justice officials, the Director of National Intelligence, Department of Homeland Security officials, and officials from the White House counsel's office, Mr. Trump's internal counsels within the office of president. And so
what they're saying right now speaks to his intent regarding the new charges. He was told by everybody around him that he lost the election, pretty much.
With all of those people telling Mr. Trump he lost and being designated in the indictment as having done that, it becomes that much more difficult for Mr. Trump to claim he lacked the requisite intent. So that's how these cases are often sort of framed for battle: government proving intent, a defendant arguing he didn't form the requisite intent. But it seems here that the government, Mr. Smith and his team of prosecutors and agents, have thought carefully about that already.
All right, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you. Let me go to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. I bought you as much time as I could.
I appreciate that.
Just so y'all know, these are new charges on Trump. These are new indictments on Trump. And these are more specific to the actual election fraud, what he tried to do to defraud the American people, which is a crime. It's a crime. You trying to change the vote, stop the vote, interfere with the vote of the American people. It is a crime. And guess what? Judges have the duty to also serve the citizen in this, who are the victims. When you're stopping the vote, the victim or attempting to tamper with the vote, guess what, y'all? The citizens are the victims. Yes, the victims. It's the citizens. And the judge, in regard to a speedy trial or regard to having a trial, Trump can say he wants a speedy trial. That's who has the right to a speedy trial. Do you think Trump is going to say that? But regardless if it's speedy or not, or what Trump demands, if he says he wants a slow trial, he waives that right. The judge also has an obligation to the victims, and the judge can refuse it. any prolonging of a trial. You see what I mean? This trial can clearly happen before this, any election date, any day for a vote. This trial can clearly happen. And in my view, if the judges are serving the people as the victims, it has to be waived in this situation, because this is about who's going to be the president in the first place. You see what I mean? The two don't match up. You can't have it both ways. So people need to put pressure on the judge. Not saying that the judge wouldn't do that. I'm just saying, beware. Have your antennas up. Also, people need to be going right now to the Supreme Court. All of this stuff is about stopping your rights as a citizen. All of it. Everything Trump did was about the people's actual rights under the Constitution being taken away or subverted. You see? And I don't understand, why would anybody want a gun? Pretty much. I mean, it says it in the Constitution, to defend. To defend. The Constitution is the main reason to defend. Citizens having a right to defend themselves is the main reason why you have a gun in the first place. Against an authoritarian regime, against an autocrat is why. That's one of the main reasons. If not one, it's number two, to defend yourself against an autocrat. That's your main reason. It seems to me Trump is that autocrat. He tried to subvert the law. He tried to subvert the will of the American people. The law is the American people. It's your civilian rights. The country is run by civilians. It's a civilian country, you see, according to the Constitution. So I don't know. People should be up in arms about Donald Trump. People, and not about defending him. They should be up in arms. They should have kicked his ass out of the country a long time ago. And I'm going to tell you, there's loads. Most other democracies, NATO nations, would never stand for it. And people don't even have guns. They would be out in the street burning shit down, like flat out. That's what you saw in Paris. They tried to raise the date on on retirement. Riots everywhere, because that's something the people pay into. That's the people stuff. You see what I mean? Sometimes I think American people, the media plays a role, and some of the politicians play a role in subverting the people's actual civilian rights, subverting that. They discuss it like somehow this is not a big thing. Yo, first of all, no matter what party you're in, you should be against Donald Trump. Otherwise, why are you a damn civilian? Why are you a citizen of the United States of America if you're not against Trump? That doesn't make no sense, because he's not for your rights. He's not for you. He's clearly subverting your rights as a citizen. Now, isn't that why you have a gun? Isn't that why? Tell me I'm wrong. Let's listen more.
In this document, what stands out to you?
A couple of interesting things. The story that the prosecutors are telling here is incredibly detailed, and we're still working our way through it. But to Chuck's point, talking about the former president's intent, on page 7, they lay out all of the times, and these probably aren't all of the that they've collected, but they give some examples of the times that the former president was told that the things that he was saying publicly were flat out false. And the reason that they're doing that is because they need to show that he was acting with some sort of corrupt mindset. And they don't have to show that he was told directly that you're breaking the law. But the fact that they have on several different occasions here, people telling him there was no evidence of widespread fraud, people telling him that the vice president didn't single-handedly have the power to overturn the will of the people, does bolster their case. And it's interesting. They specifically say the defendant had a right, like every American, to publicly speak about the election. This is on page 3. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results through lawful and appropriate means. What he was not allowed to do was to try to actually use improper means to overturn the election results. And the best example is, imagine for a moment that you think a bank has taken your money. You notice a strange withdrawal on your bank account, and you think that wasn't right. The right way to challenge that is to actually go through a process. The right way to challenge that is not to rob the bank. And that's essentially what they indicted him for here, was to use improper means. Even if he thought that he was the right elector, even if he thought that he had actually somehow won the election despite all of the evidence to the contrary, prosecutors are saying here is you actually have to challenge it through the appropriate court process, and that is not what he did in this case.
Let's bring in your co-reader here, Danny Savalas, an NBC News legal analyst. What stands out to you? What have you been able to learn from this?
For me, thinking about a potential defense of Trump has always revolved around how can he claim ignorance and how will DOJ address this in the indictment? And they do, because the key is if Trump opposed this election the way he did, what if he believed that his claims were true? And the indictment addresses that. It addresses that Trump had knowledge, or at least reason to know, that his claims were false. And they list that right on page 7. They list all the different people and entities that told him, essentially, Mr. President, you are wrong. And that includes the vice president, senior leaders of the Justice Department. You have the director of national intelligence. You have the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. All of these people are combining to tell the president that there's no there. There is no fraud. You're wrong. And so in light of all of these people telling him that and him proceeding, that allows an inference that the president at the time knew what he was doing was wrong, knew that he did not have a valid claim that the election was stolen. And so for me, that has always been the key, that if they charge him with any of these crimes, whether it's conspiracy to defraud the United States or conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, much of his defense.
Now, you got to remember, when they say conspiracy to defraud the United States, they're talking about the American people. They're talking about the civilian. They're talking about the citizen population. Those of you who believe citizens run the country, which you should believe, they're talking about you when they say that.
Would revolve if they charge him with any of these crimes, whether it's conspiracy to defraud the United States or conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, much of his defense would revolve around the claim that I believe that what I was doing was right. Yes, there were courts that were dismissing my claims. Yes, the liberal media, for example, was saying that I was wrong, but I believed it, and I had enough people around me telling me that it was reasonable for me to think so. That's the core of his defense. I mean, the only other real defense is getting elected and appointing an attorney general to get rid of these charges. But the key here is, how do you address Trump's knowledge? It's always been the key. And now we see in this indictment, they're addressing it.
But correct me if I'm wrong, did not evidence come out during the January 6 hearings that there were those who heard him acknowledge that he knew he'd lost?
Yes, exactly. So that is going to be part of this, the government's burden of proof here. It may be somewhere in these words, but Laura and I and everybody else were furiously going through it. But they feature prominently right up front. They list all the different agencies and entities and people. And I always suspected that that would feature prominently in any indictment. The fact that senior members of the DOJ told him, you're wrong, including his outgoing attorney general, who sat him down and said, these claims, there's nothing there. And I suspected rather, that the indictment would also have a lot on the fact that Donald Trump attempted to subvert, allegedly, the DOJ to achieve his election goals. Beyond being just morally culpable, you're going to have a lot of witnesses who are senior DOJ members, people who oppose this, and people who are going to be credible in a way that co-conspirators or cooperating witnesses ordinarily aren't. These are going to be very credible witnesses. And for the most part, we've already heard their story through the January 6th committee testimony and hearings from last summer. So we all knew most of the operative facts. The government is now saying those operative facts make out specific cases: conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of official proceeding. There you have it. We may have already known what happened. Now we know how the government sees that, and they see it as a crime.
All right. And I should point out to folks, this is a pretty lengthy document you're all going through. So we appreciate you going through it and pulling out the salient facts. I also want to let folks know that we're now expecting to hear from Jack Smith in a briefing or a statement coming up perhaps within the next 10 minutes or so. We'll keep you up to date on that. Let me bring in former federal prosecutor at NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, a lot to go through. I don't know what you'll be able to read. One of the issues I know going into this was whether they would focus on the so-called fake electors. Do we know if that's included in here?
That is actually the bulk of what is included in here, Lester. And I think what people are going to wonder is, gee, after everything we heard in the January 6th congressional hearing, how come we don't see charges relating to the actual violent breach of the Capitol that day? Isn't that so much of what the investigation in Congress took place with? And I think this was a very, very deliberate and smart decision on Jack Smith's part. He decided, I'm going to focus on the case that is easily, readily provable, and I'm not going to get involved in this brawl that took place on the grounds of the Capitol that day, because that is a trial that could take a long time. And at the end of the day, I don't know if I can get a conviction of Donald Trump on that. And remember, Donald Trump is now looking at 3 and possibly 4 criminal trials within the next year if they're all going to get done before the election. Jack Smith cannot afford to have a trial that goes on for 8 months. He needs to be surgical. He needs to get this conviction quickly. And it's rather unusual to have a conspiracy indictment brought where so many of the conspirators are not charged. They are unindicted conspirators described in the indictment. Only one individual is named in this indictment as a defendant, and that is Donald Trump. And that is likely because Jack Smith is trying to keep this case confined so that it can be tried quickly and he doesn't have to deal with multi-defendant cases.
Now, wait just a minute.